Metaphor as Myth and as Religion. Campbell opens this chapter with a characterization of myth. Like dreams, they are the revelations of the deeper desires, hopes, fears, potentialities and conflicts of the human will, moved by the organs of the body operating variously against each other and in concert. The mythological view of the world is in fact, to some extent in accordance with Kant's critical philosophy, which also claims that both life forms and inorganic physical objects are metaphysically grounded in a realm beyond phenomenal space, time, and matter, a realm that can only be reached by the mind. A temple, for example, is more than a building for worship. It is, as Campbell puts it, a concretization of the noumenal world, a bearer of many symbolic properties that relate to the transcendental realm of the sacred. There are many interesting relations between the mythological view of the world and the aesthetic views of the beautiful and sublime, which bring us into contact with a repertoire of emotions that relate either to the form or the formlessness of the object we are confronting/contemplating. In Kant's account of the dynamically sublime, from his third critique, the human will plays an important role, and insofar as the appreciation of beautiful works of art are intentionally produced objects, the will is obviously involved in this experience too. One of the aims of the artist is to induce a feeling of pleasure in the audience of the work, a feeling that Kant argues is based on the harmony of the operation of the faculties of the imagination and the understanding. The task the artist sets for his audience is also one of passing judgment upon the work as a whole. This involves the application of some universal idea to the particulars of the object created. A transcendental principle is involved in this transaction, a principle Kant describes in terms of the form of finality of the object. The aesthetic judgment is characterized by Kant as one in which we demand agreement, on the basis of the fact that the feeling of pleasure experienced is grounded in the harmony of the faculties. Even in this pure form, the mind, Kant argues, is also prepared for moral feeling because beauty is the symbol of morality. The feelings related to the experience of the sublime, on the other hand, relates to ideas of practical reason that are connected to our moral agency. Mythological views of death relate more closely to ideas we find in the various religions. Freud, we know, in his later writings, was influenced by Greek mythology and its view of Thanatos, but Freud, the scientist, also grounds the phenomenon of death in science. In his work Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud claims, the attributes of life were at some time evolved in inanimate matter by the action of a force of whose nature we can form no conception. The tension which then arose in what had hitherto been inanimate substance endeavored to cancel itself out. In this way the first drive came into being, the drive to return to the inanimate state. Beyond the Pleasure Principle in Metapsychological Papers, page 38. This is the beginning stage of Freud's so-called mythology of the instincts. Life emerged at some point in the history of the earth, and just as its origin is a mystery, so is its end, because in the case of every living individual, the dead body no longer displays any signs of consciousness or life. Life as such will continue when these individuals die, but only until that point at which their time has come, as we say. In human sush, the understanding and acknowledgement of these facts is part of the function of the ego, which is carried out in accordance with the reality principle. It is the ego which is the dynamic agency responsible for the protection and preservation of the body and the self. As an agency, it is situated topographically in all three zones of the unconscious, the preconscious, and consciousness. The pleasure ego is the most primitive aspect of the undeveloped ego, which also has an intimate connection with the biological energy regulation principle that basically aims for the homeostasis of the body, whilst still keeping some energy in reserve for some special or emergency actions. The ego, that is, learns to postpone gratification, tolerating the painful tension involved in the postponement of desired actions. Freud appeals to Fechner's connection of the feeling of pleasure to topographical consciousness. Insofar as conscious impulses always have some relation to pleasure or unpleasure, pleasure and unpleasure too can be regarded as having a psychophysical relation to conditions of stability and instability. Every psychophysical motion rising above the threshold of consciousness is attended by pleasure in proportion, as beyond a certain limit, it approximates to complete stability, and is attended by unpleasure in proportion as, beyond a certain limit, it deviates from complete stability. While between the limits which may be described as qualitative thresholds of pleasure and unpleasure, there is a certain margin of aesthetic indifference. Beyond the pleasure principle, pages 226-7. There is, then, in Freud's work complex relations between the biological energy regulation principle and the psychological pleasure-unpleasure and reality principles. We should recall in the context of this discussion the theory of pleasure presented by Plato via Socrates in the dialogue, The Republic. In this dialogue, Plato argues for an important distinction between the pleasures of the body which are transitory and mixed with pain, and the pleasures of the soul, which are more aligned with the fulfillment of our more spiritual needs, e.g. our need for knowledge, reason, and virtue. We note that, neither in Plato's view, nor in Freud's view, are these accounts contaminated with a theory of consciousness which insists that I cannot be mistaken about my experience of pleasure. There are, of course, affections of the body which cease before they are registered in consciousness, and the energy regulation principle will explain such phenomena adequately by reference to the telos of body/organ functioning, namely homeostasis. Obviously, homeostatic functioning of the organs is an important condition for both short-term survival, but also long-term quality of life. There is a complex overlaying and integration of biological/psychological and mental powers which may make it difficult for the individual to categorically know what kind of pleasure that they are experiencing. Indeed, Socrates in Plato's Republic points to the relativity of pleasure/happiness when he notes that healthy people may not consciously relate their happiness specifically to their health. If, however, they become ill, they may well, upon returning to a healthy state, be happy about such a change in their state. If such an individual is, moreover, poverty-stricken, they may experience unpleasure until their toil and work takes them out of such a state. They might temporarily feel as if they could not feel happier until, as was the case with the character Cephalus in the Republic, they have their money unjustly taken away by an agency like the state. The politicians responsible for taking the money of Cephalus may well temporarily feel pleasure, until other politicians take their money away, or perhaps they may even conspire to have their victims murdered. Such a sequence of cases is, of course, the reason why Socrates and Aristotle recommended leading the examined/contemplative life, which, according to both philosophers, knows all the different kinds of pleasure, and knows that the pleasure of leading an examined/contemplative life is the most reliable and best. What we have described are Plato's objective criteria for leading a life of virtue determined by the form of the good. The subjective account of the wealthy man's transitory happiness and the politician's transitory happiness are based on subjective perceptions of pleasure. Plato even describes the life of the powerful ruling tyrant, a bloodthirsty life that ends in premature death because of the lack of understanding of the importance of the virtuous life. What gives the tyrant pleasure, or makes him happy, are giving in to the temptations of both unnecessary and unlawful desires. Plato's theoretical account of pleasure and pain maintains that they are not, as common sense would have it, contraries. There is in fact a middle ground between these two types of experience. In other words, not all experience is either pleasurable or painful. Some experiences are neutral. The reason we believe that the neutral ground belongs in the territory of these so-called contraries is that if either pleasure or pain are immediately adjacent to a neutral experience, there is a tendency to give the neutral ground the name of what one has experienced immediately prior to the neutral experience. Alternatively, there is a tendency, upon feeling relief from bodily pain, to name the absence of pain as pleasing. Now, whilst knowledge of the good must be related to desire, knowledge of the truth need not be. For example, on thinking through the sequence of premises, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal, I know all these premises to be true irrespective of any feelings I may have, e.g. regret at the death of Socrates. The interesting question to raise in this context is whether, in knowing the truth that I am mortal, I can grasp this truth in a desire-free state. according to both Spinoza and Freud, the desire to continue existing is one of the strongest of the animal desires. Yet we find Socrates, in his death cell, claiming that death is good. Is this because he lived the examined life as part of his 80 years and 10? The religious individual's acceptance of their death is perhaps not quite in the same spirit, believing as they do in a life after death, which has no philosophical support. True acceptance of death would seem to entail being cleansed of all fear and desire, and this might not be true of religious individuals with false beliefs, firstly, about their God being the only God, and secondly, about a life after death. Freud's view of stability is certainly connected to the Greek idea of eudaimonia, the good-spirited flourishing life, which requires the overlaying and integration of a number of different powers energized by eros or the life instinct. For Freud, it is the secondary process of the mind which sublimates the primary process, where the death instinct, or thanatos, may be playing a larger role in the life of the individual. The primary process of the mind is the process in which the most primitive instinctive drives of the mind strive for uninhibited gratification. The secondary process seeks to postpone all such gratification in favor of less dangerous and more lasting, secure gratifications. Both Socrates and Aristotle agree that secondary process gratifications were part of the structure of leading the examined contemplative life. Freud elaborates upon this theme. We know that the pleasure principle is proper to a primary method of working on the part of the mental apparatus, but that from the point of view of the self-preservation of the organism among the difficulties of the external world, it is from the very outset inefficient and even highly dangerous. The pleasure principle long persists, however, as the method of working employed by the sexual instincts which are so hard to educate, and starting from these instincts, or in the ego itself, it often succeeds in overcoming the reality principle, to the detriment of the organism as a whole. Page 278. This entails, Freud argues, that two defenses are used by the ego against the primary process pleasure principle, namely splitting and repression. In the former case, those instincts that are difficult to educate are split off from consciousness, and they are then repressed, allowing the ego to compensate for this loss of energy by using another defense mechanism, namely sublimation, to produce creations of works of art. In a long section of this essay, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud discusses what we know about life at the cellular level, and in so doing, admits that we know as little about the origins of the sexual instinct as we know about the origins of life. After postulating and abandoning various hypotheses, he finally settles upon what he calls a mythological account that originates in both Plato's Symposium and the Indian Upanishads. In these latter writings Atman felt no delight. Therefore a man that is lonely feels no delight. He wished for a second. He was so large as man and wife together. He then made himself fall into two, and then arose husband and wife. Footnote page 331. Freud, however, remains hesitant and treats his final position on this issue as a speculative hypothesis, naming this position as his mythology of the instincts. On this final account, sexuality's function is to reconcile the two halves of split man, each desiring the other, not romantically, but out of biological/psychological necessity, platonic love. On this account, hate belongs to that other school of instincts, death, construed as the destroyer of worlds, Bhagavad Gita. After a protracted hylomorphic discussion, which included Schopenhauer's claim that the purpose of life is death, Freud finally placed his hope in future biological science. If Schopenhauer is correct in his characterization of the relation of these two different groups of instincts, then this kind of account would allow us to understand more fully that Socratic moment in the Phaedo where Socrates claims that whatever death is in its nature, it must be good. Perhaps such an interpretation would also allow a more complete understanding of the oracular proclamation that everything created by humans is destined for ruin and destruction. The above interpretations perhaps would lead man to appreciate more fully the life he is currently leading, as well as the reason why it is important to strive for the examined/contemplative life. Aristotelian hylomorphism seems, then, to make even more sense in the context of a discussion in which life is portrayed as an irritation/excitation of inorganic matter that is temporarily displaced whilst life continues to exist. Aristotle postulated the idea of prime matter, and whatever that is in its nature, we can, Aristotle argues, only know of it in some form, shape. Life, for this hylomorphic view, is an energetic organization of matter, and death occurs, either when this energy dissipates, or the organs necessary for the distribution and transformation of energy are no longer able to maintain the minimum requirements of homeostasis. A stone is formed matter, as is a star and a galaxy. The kingdom of minerals have their forms and functions, as do the kingdom of plants and animals. We, according to Aristotle, have the potentiality to become both the worst and the best of animals, suggesting that the constellation of the powers of the human sush may well be a mixed blessing. The question to raise here is whether the study of mythology can lead to a greater understanding of the origins and telos of the three kingdoms proposed by Linnaeus. Campbell claims that mythology can release us from fixation upon false ideas, which, if true, indicates an important kinship with both ancient Greek and Enlightenment philosophy. He initiates a discussion of Kantian critical philosophy, one of whose aims was certainly to neutralize the power of false claims by analyzing the logical properties of judgments based on a trifold characterization of the faculties of human sush, sensibility, understanding, and reason. Kant draws a major distinction between a posteriori judgments based upon experience and a priori judgments which are known via the analysis of concepts. It is interesting, in such a context, to pose the question whether the judgment, all men are mortal, is an example of an analytic or a synthetic judgment, based on experience. The concept of mortality would appear to have a necessary relation to the concept of man, because man belongs primarily to the kingdom of living things, and the final cause or condition for the existence of living things is that they will inevitably die, and return their inorganic elements to the earth. Freud pointed this out and claimed that this process was operating even during life in the form of a drive. Kant's idea of death is that it is the end of life, and he claims further that since life is the condition of all possible experience, including the experience of the soul as an object, death is the end of all experience. Prolegomena p.76, section 48. All men are mortal, cannot, then, be known by experience, because the species of man stretches far into the future, beyond our current experience, and whether or not all men are going to die cannot be verified at any present moment. This does not mean that this statement is either false or meaningless, but rather that it has to be supported by judgments relating to the totality of conditions constituting life and its ultimate end in death. It must, therefore, be a contradiction to claim that men are not mortal, given all the facts that can be produced in support of this judgment, e.g. hylomorphic facts about the nature of cells, tissues, organs, etc. The question that remains hanging in the air is whether all men are mortal. Is an analytic or synthetic a priori judgment, since both are related in different ways to the principles of non-contradiction and sufficient reason. Kant claims that metaphysics rests upon a base of synthetic a priori judgments, which connect concepts necessarily, but not analytically, i.e. mortality may not be contained in the concept of man, because it is science that classifies man as an entity within a much larger class of animals, namely, all living things. Now, whilst the origin of life may be a mystery, its natural manifestations in accordance with principles governing such manifestations are not. It is therefore the task of the Aristotelian essence-specifying definition of man to locate him in the animal kingdom, and at the same time to differentiate him from other members of this class, via his unique powers of discourse and rationality. All animals may be mortal, but not all animals can speak and reason. Knowledge of biology is the science we rely upon to provide us with the essence-specifying definitions of all living things. The human sush, on the other hand, requires not just the knowledge of biology, but knowledge of many disciplines, if we are going to be able to understand the full range and limitations of its powers. Mythology, like many other disciplines, if it is to continue occupying an important role in our lives, must acknowledge the above biological, philosophical, and psychological accounts of the being of human being, which includes knowledge of life, death, space, time, and matter. Paul Ricoeur summarizes the function of myth well in his work, Symbolism of Evil. Myths will be here taken to mean what the history of religions now finds in it, not a false explanation by means of images and fables, but a traditional narration which relates to events that happened at the beginning of time, and which has the purpose of providing grounds for the ritual actions of men today, and, in a general manner, establishing all the forms of action and thought by which man understands himself in his world. For us moderns, a myth is only a myth because one no longer connects mythical places with our geographical space. This is why myth can no longer be an explanation. But in losing its explanatory pretensions, the myth reveals its exploratory significance and its contribution to understanding, which we shall later call its symbolic function. That is to say, its power of discovering and revealing the bond between man and what he considers sacred. Page 5. One recalls in this context the insistence by many scientists that, for example, the city of Troy was a fabled location, until in the 19th century, when it was actually discovered to have existed. Nevertheless, it can be argued that mythological thinking, even of the literate societies, has its limitations. In a review of Paul Ricoeur's Time and Narrative, Volume 1, the following is claimed. The limitations of myth may well have given birth to philosophy, when it came to providing explanations demanded by aporetic questions, and raising issues relating to the infinite media of change, namely, space, time, and matter. It no longer seemed efficacious to personify time by the figure or image of Kronos, engaging in the curious activity of eating his children, and being castrated by the most powerful of his children. Such images just did not seem to respond appropriately to the awe and wonder of a newly awoken consciousness in the face of the sublimity of life in a world of such complexity. These images did not possess the required universality and necessity of the philosophical principle of sufficient reason. http://michaelartjames.org. Some commentators, however, have been carried away by the desire to criticize the limitations of myth, e.g. Ernst Cassirer in his work Language and Myth, Translanger S.K., New York, Dover, 1946. Cassirer points to the Socratic complaint from the dialogue The Phaedrus, in which, to explain death by an image of a godlike wind whisking the soul away is to misunderstand the phenomenon of death. Neither gods nor monsters, Socrates argued, meet the criteria of sufficient reason demanded by philosophical explanation.